Okay, we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. So great to have you joining us. I have with me today Dr. Matthew Gerlach and my good friend Jean-luc. So we're going to have a great conversation. It's exciting. This is the first time we've done a conversation with three people. So we'll see how that goes. Got to play off each other. But I just want to say hello to both of you guys. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here.
Mm-hmm, of course.
Absolutely. Thank you, Avery.
Yeah. So usually we kind of give it the first minute or so just to let people kind of stumble upon the live stream, and usually just like to make a little bit of small talk, but we will get started shortly. I guess Dr. Gerlach, you're in Detroit, and Jean-luc, you're in the Vancouver area.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Langley, BC.
Okay. Is it raining there?
It's not raining. No, it's actually a beautiful sunny day.
Wow. Enjoy it while you have it.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dr. Gerlach is was one of my professors at the seminary down in Detroit, and it looks like you are not in your office right now.
This is my home office, which is basically a partially converted walk-in closet that I've set up my books. I mean, a lot of my books are missing from my office at work now. They're now here, and I've actually, this shows you the generosity of a spouse. My wife has moved lots of her stuff out of here so that I could actually have a place at home that's dedicated to working remotely. So
that's
thanks
awesome.
to her. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the home office has become kind of the modus operandi in COVID. A lot of people having to remotely, I guess, but the seminary is open, no?
It is open, but in a limited capacity. Like we're asked not to work there unless we need to be present for either teaching or in-person meetings that we can't do otherwise. Sure. Access to files, hard copy files, things like that. So yeah, so it's a bummer. We all want to be back. We all want to be going to the chapel and, you know, all the different just great things about being physically there. You know what it's like to be there. It's just a wonderful, just kind of sacred spot. The Puabic tile and the wood and the stone and, you know, this not medieval, but Gothic.
That's right.
Feels like a castle. The priests were joking about that the other day. It's like,
yeah. Oh, it's a big building. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're praying the pandemic will end soon. Kind of things will get back to normal, hopefully in the summer and fall. Anyway, we're going to be moving into our main topic now. I just want to say hello to all of our viewers watching on either Facebook or on YouTube. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to any comments that you may have, any questions. You can always post those in the comment section below the video, and we'll be able to see that in real time and be able to respond to you and to any questions you may have in real time. So I guess starting off our conversation here, looking at the area of human sexuality, this great gift that we've been given. And just by way of some kind of preliminary remarks, I think our culture has a certain framework in which we view this, which is very kind of utilitarian. It's all about, you know, this sense of immediate gratification and, you know, the success or the failure of, you know, the sexual act kind of being defined by that. I guess for either of you to answer, why do you think that this framework, you know, why is it kind of an impoverished view, and how can we kind of orient ourselves a little bit differently to better understand this topic?
Well, I'm going to defer to Jean-luc on all this.
No, I'm kidding. Let's start this one off for us. It's a theological answer, and I'll give the more human response. Because I think even in a purely psychological framework, it's still impoverished.
Sure.
First. Okay. Yeah, well, so, I mean, gosh, that's really a huge question. It's impoverished in so many different ways, but I think that you could look at it at, well, you know, the kind of Christian way of looking at sexuality is traditionally understanding that we're called to make a gift of ourselves to the other in marriage, and this is expressed concretely in an embodied way, this gift of self in the sexual act, right? And the sexual act is so meaningful, so powerful, has so much kind of crammed into it from God, like God designed things this way, that it's both a way of enriching the life of the other, of fulfillment of ourselves, and the possibility of bringing new human life into existence through procreation. And so once you kind of strip aside the other, and in terms of their good, the good of the other, the good of the spouse, and then you strip away the possibility of procreation, and then strip everything down to just the pleasure of the individual as the fulfilling aspect of the act. I mean, it's really impoverished. It's down to
Sure.
So that would be my first kind of go at an answer with that.
Yeah, and I think
Sure.
I want to add, when it comes to even just the fulfillment part of the marital act, like I think a lot of times we focus on like the very physical, like climax part of it, but there's also the emotional that comes with it, and that's intricately bound with that experience. And so when people are focusing purely on the physical side of things, they're oftentimes ignorant of the emotional ramifications, and also of the naturally binding nature of the marital act, right? So physically, yes, it binds you to that person. They will actually crave to be with you more because they've received something with you and absorbed that into themselves that draws them to you. But also emotionally, there's a lack because it's supposed to be an emotionally satisfying experience, right? Our brains are hardwired like that as well. And so to pursue just pure pleasure is to impoverish yourself even of the purely human side, the very carnal side of things, because that has a lot bound into it.
Mm-hmm.
So both spiritually
Sure.
and physically and corporally, it's impoverished.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's, yeah. I think that's a great point. And I think what you guys are both getting at is there's a certain sense in which our sexuality is not just kind of one little dimension that doesn't affect anything else, and we can kind of just, satisfy this urge, just kind of like, grab chips off the counter and eat and then just, go on our way. It's like everything, is affected by it. And it's integrated into, our overall emotional and obviously our spiritual health. I just realized before we kind of continue, and not to interrupt our conversation as we're going, but I never gave you guys a chance to introduce yourselves. If you could just give yourselves, just give us a quick, very brief introduction, only because people probably don't know who you are. So we'll jump back to our topic in a second. But if you could, maybe Dr. Gerlach, if you could start just a very quick synopsis of who you are, and then Jean-luc, if you want to follow after that.
Sure. I guess perhaps most relevantly, I'm married with children, and then I'm a theologian by training. Teach at Sacred Heart, as well as, and my main position there is as dean of the lay students, the non-seminary, non-priestly types, those who are in
like
ministry. Yep, like Avery. And so been at this for a few years now. And just always in awe of the goodness of the Lord in the church's teachings, and the good news that it is, and really try to share that in the classroom and in my formation work with lay students.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and as for myself, I'm single, but I just recently earned my degree in marriage and family therapy, and I'm now working as a clinical counselor. So I'm in the beginning stage of the doctor here, and I'm fairly certain I'm called to marriage. So I'm just waiting for the right person to come along. But in the meantime, I'm just trying to do good work and learn a little bit more about how human beings bond and connect and can find healing through that connection. And that's a major focus of my work. So.
Awesome.
Yeah. So perfect tie into what we're talking about. So thank you. I just, especially for you, Jean-luc, it's like you just put your name. And so I'm just thinking it's like people are going to hear you talking about, psychology and, emotional wounds. And it's like, who is this guy?
Right,
what is he?
Right. I should have put my name after my name.
That's okay. Anyway, for those who are watching, Jean-luc is a practicing counselor.
Yes,
so
it's a
good insight.
Master's of Arts in Marriage and Family Therapy.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
So returning to our topic at hand, yeah, so this this kind of moving away from this rather impoverished view, which I think is very much kind of a reduction of what as Christians we would understand, right? And so I think the helpful way for people that are maybe living in a situation or are in a lifestyle where they are this maybe kind of falling short of what the bar is set for, this very high standard of what marriage and family life is supposed to look like. Just to really encourage you, it's not to condemn you outright, but or anything like that, but just to say that there's so much more. I think is the way that we want to understand this, that the experience of our human sexuality, there's so much more that God wants to give to us. And most people, our society has kind of jettisoned God in a lot of ways, but and certainly even among Christians, this idea that God wants to be intimately involved with our intimate life can seem a little bit foreign. But I think, everything the church teaches and everything that we can see from our own design would say otherwise. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, what hits me as you're talking is I just think of an analogy with my kids. Like I think one of the big roles of parenting is to try to teach your kids how to eat healthy, right? And it's not easy. And you have to actually try at it because they're going to always opt and default for what tastes best, what's easiest to cook. All those kinds of reductions, you might say, of good nutrition. And ourselves, I struggle with that too. At times I want to okay, what's the fastest thing? I got to get back to work or whatever. And then what tastes the best, But what tastes the best, what's the easiest is not going to be necessarily the healthiest for me or what God designed for, eating to be. Eating is meant to be, eating a meal together in community, if when possible, is the kind of fullest, sense of what, ultimately it wasn't just to nourish our bodies with the bare minimum, but with everything that God has given us through creation to nourish our bodies in a healthy way, the proper nutrition in a communal experience where there's something much more than just a physical act of nutrition taking place. There is a social and emotional nutrition that's taking place, and so in an analogous way, I think, the Heavenly Father has this plan for both for eating, but also for sexuality. And even the sexual pleasure that's part of that to be enhanced and enriched in a fuller context, right? And so you think about this is definitely a reduction that we see with on-demand. Think about all the apps that are out there of the burgeoning, the sexual exploitation that's taking place because it preys on that basic, default that we tend to as human beings of what's the easiest, what's most pleasurable for the moment, instead of thinking bigger.
Sure. Jean-Luc, any thoughts on that?
He covered it. I don't have too much to add on that point, really.
Okay.
At least not right now. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Honest answer. Yeah, I think you used a great analogy there with nutrition, right? And people would recognize, and I think it's Christopher West who kind of used this. If you start eating out of the dumpster, you're going to get sick. You might be filled for a second, but you're going to get sick, right? And I think we can understand a kind of reductionist, impoverished view of sexuality much the same way. Flipping the question, I think we need to be also forthcoming. What does the church actually teach, and what does this actually mean? And to preface this too by saying, sometimes, especially in the area of human sexuality, I think there's a temptation for even people in the church to have this kind of use kind of fancy words, but like ecclesial positivism, which basically says something is right and it's a sin or not just because the church says so. And we want to say morality is a lot bigger than that. It's not just a sin because the church said so. It's falling short of God's design for our humanity and for the eternal destiny we're called to, precisely because it works against the way that God has made us, right? And you could choose any area of our lives, but especially with sexuality, it's not just this arbitrary rule. Well, the church says, divorce is bad. It's our human nature. Actually, there's something about, the separation of a lifelong union that has some serious ramifications for us and actually works against our own happiness. So with all that being said, I know both of you are familiar with certainly church teaching, and especially the theology of the body of St. Pope John Paul II. So I'm wondering if you guys could maybe provide us with just a few insights from that, specifically regarding, how we've been created as human beings, this idea that we're made as a gift of self, and how that's fulfilled within the plan of sexuality within the context of marriage. So Jean-Luc, maybe if you want to start.
Yeah, the first stab this time. Yeah, when you first started talking about this sort of ecclesiopositivism, I think it has many different forms and type of lack that we'll accept in the marital act and sex, especially within marriage, and even without. And I think one thing I hear a lot, or the impression I get a lot, is like it really is about like the sexual pleasure, or maybe like the woman's supposed to please the guy, right? And it's mostly about him and just kind of keeping his needs met. And those needs are purely the pleasurable part, or releasing the tension there. And that's part of it, but it's a mutual giving, as Dr. mentioned before. And that includes even that emotional connection that goes into it. Like both of you should come out of sex feeling emotionally satisfied too, right? And more connected, not just physically satisfied or less tense or whatever else, but also, that your bond has deepened. And this mostly comes to mind to me right now because I was listening to a debate recently, and it was about lying, but they moved on to this other topic of sexuality, and kind of one of the things they were putting as important the important part of the marital act was one important part, besides of course reproduction first, was like consolation. And it's not merely about even consolation, it's about bonding, right? It's about like the mutual good of the other within sex is that bonding experience alongside, and certainly below the openness to reproduction. But that's a close second, because that's part of the process of drawing closer to become saints, and to have an experience, even just a small experience, of God's love through that act. Mm-hmm. And that full understanding is necessary, I think, for sex to have the fullness that God intended for us. It should be like the benefits of that should flow to every other part of life, and vice versa, right? Just as you staying healthy physically and you being emotionally healthy outside of the marital act with your spouse will contribute to better sex. Better sex will then contribute to the other stuff too. So,
sure, that's yeah. Thank you, Dr. Gerlach. Any thoughts on that?
Well, plenty. I think just thinking about some of the theology of the body, John Paul II, St. John Paul now, has this idea of the nuptial meaning of the body, that kind of written on our body in its kind of procreative capacity, but also its complementarity in terms of the different sexes of male and female, that God made us for both communion with him, but also communion with one another. And this is kind of symbolized in the difference of male and female. And so we're naturally called to the vocation of marriage in terms of that difference, of maleness and femaleness. But that's a symbol of something much bigger, which is that we're called out of ourselves, instead of just like taking from the world that God made and for ourselves. There's also this sense of self-gift that's written into us, that there's a giving and receiving, and a receiving and giving of ourselves to the other, our spouse. And that type of giving and receiving, for it to mean what it really is meant to mean, but also as human beings, what we need it to mean, really has to have a context of marriage, right? So I think there's a fragility of the human person when sex is robbed of its fuller context, right? So where it was reduced, for example, to pleasure. And so, if the act itself means something like, I give myself completely to you, my bride, then there has to be a larger context that says the same thing, because it can't just be an encounter and then there's no fuller life together that signifies the same thing. I've given myself to you through the marriage vow, and I'm still giving myself today and tomorrow, and I promise to always give myself for you. And so I think that the wedding vows express this theology of the body and the nuptial meaning of the body in particular, in the way that we're called to self-gift, in a way that is a true gift of self, a sincere gift of self. That's how we find self-fulfillment, by you could say, not focusing on ourselves, but on the good of the other, or in the good that can come from the two of us together, instead of just like, okay, what am I going to do? How can I, consume more for myself, and somehow find fulfillment?
Yeah, that's great points there. You touched on a lot of different things, but I think one of the things that's really key and very countercultural is this idea that that our sexuality is most fully lived out within the context of marriage, right? In this public, very much communal commitment to another person that involves lifelong fidelity and the openness to children. And so, I guess, Jean-luc, just kind of addressing you on this, it seems to me that the perception of many with regards to sexuality is it's just really what matters is one, the physical attractiveness of your mate, and then two, the actual technique involved. And so if you have those two things and you've set up all the right conditions and you've set the mood and you're a master technique, whatever, that's where that's when the best sexual experience is lived out. But from what Dr. Gerlach is saying, and this would be the kind of the church's stance, is that actually the fullest expression depends far less on those merely external factors or a matter of technique, and much more on that kind of lifelong commitment and the security that comes from that. And so things like taking out the garbage for your spouse, things like complimenting your spouse or supporting them when they are struggling, those things actually are going to be more beneficial to your sex life than things like, memorizing the Kama Sutra.
Right. And we know this, even scientifically now, research on what's called attachment theory, or other research regarding sex is bearing out that it's the emotional side of things that's probably the greatest predictor of how good your sexual experience is going to be, because it takes down all the barriers that would make you anxious about it, particularly for women. And it creates, that as you mentioned, that safety and that security by which you can openly engage with yourself very vulnerably, right? And to show a much deeper part of yourself to someone else and to trust them with it. And that's far more satisfying. And we know this from the studies that couples that are able to connect emotionally are far more satisfied in every aspect of the relationship, including sex, than couples who aren't. So it's not really so much even about maximum attractiveness, which is great. Right? It's nice. Sure. But the more attractive thing is, am I safe around you? Do I love you? Do you love me? And, and can I be vulnerable in front of you, while we engage in this act that's pleasurable and good and wholesome intrinsically, and keep it so and make it so.
Sure.
And it's not just a theological truth now, it's also a scientific fact. We know that's how it works.
Right. Right, of course. So
faith and reason, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the fantastic thing about studying this field is seeing how true faith and reason go together. And you don't really have to fear any dichotomy there, because even in the sexual realm, the church has been right, even on a scientific level.
Right. Yeah. So we could do a whole thing on faith and reason. But just very quickly to say, of course, that as Christians, we believe that God has given us both the gift of our reason, but also divinely revealed truths and the gift of faith by which we can come to know him and know his plan for us. And so both of these things, because God can't contradict himself, both of these things have to work in tandem to ultimately lead us back to him. So some great points. I think too, maybe a little bit later, we'll maybe talk a bit more about the ways that certain expressions of the sexual act and human sexuality perhaps fall a little bit short within our cultural norms. But before we get to that, I do just want to kind of wrap up this idea of or summarize what the church is kind of teaching. So I think a helpful way to look at it precisely goes back to the marriage vows. And so I'm engaged right now, and I'm looking at these things and getting ready. And so this is very much on my mind. But if you had to boil down the marriage vows, what the church asks you to, and there's different versions, but at least the more popular one. But the church is essentially asking you to commit to is saying that you are going to be faithful to your spouse for the rest of your life. My fingers are hidden by my name. Faithful is just the rest of your life. That you come here freely, that you're not being coerced into marriage, right? It has to be a free choice. That this is going to be a total giving of yourself, right? Not just when I feel like it, not just when things are great, not just when, the money's there, but, in sickness and health, for better or worse, richer or poor, all those things. And finally, this idea that, and this one I think is perhaps the most, in some ways, the most contentious in our culture, but the idea that that marriage is supposed to be fruitful and open to new life, and that there's supposed to be this abundance spilling out of the couple's love that spills into the life of a new child. And if we can get into the specifics of what that means in a second, but Dr. Gerlach, I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to those and this understanding of how these vows correspond to the way that God has designed us.
Right. Yeah. So there's these questions that come before the wedding vows called the questions before consent, and they're to establish the fuller meaning of what the vows say, because they say certain things, but there's a meaning that obviously transcends that, the words, or that goes deeper than the words. And so there's basically questions about the intention of the couple as they approach the vows, and that fills in the vows themselves. So I'm looking at it right now just because you brought it up. At the beginning it says, so and so and so and so have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly. And their answer should be at that point, I have. Right? If it's not, then it's not going to be the kind of love that we both need to give, we're called to give, to fulfill our own personhood, but also that we're called to receive from the other. So if it's coerced, if it's forced, or if there's other kinds of serious ignorance about the other that makes us unfree, and we think we're marrying this person, but they aren't. They're deceiving us in some fundamental way about themselves. Wholeheartedly, this idea that maybe half-heartedly I'm entering marriage, like I don't really want to do this. I kind of do. Everyone's saying I should. These kinds of things, that there should be this wholehearted aspect there as well. And then the celebrant continues by asking, are you prepared as you follow the path of marriage to love and honor each other as long as you both shall live? There's that kind of permanence aspect, and some people might say, well, yeah, I am, as long as, we don't fall out of love with each other, or or he or she isn't, as long as they remain faithful to me, I'll remain faithful to them. And so this love and honor that we both need to give each other in marriage, that should be reflected in the marital act also, is this idea that we're going to be for each other for the entirety of our lives. We're stuck together. We're stuck together. And we need, I would say that, God knows we need to make a vow to this, because it's hard work to work in marriage. And that also, we could say, by kind of extrapolating that, to have the kind of sex that God wants us to have in marriage takes a lifetime of work on our marriage. So that permanence is a really important part. Do I, like you were talking about security before, do I feel secure and received by this person in my vulnerability, in my fragility as a person, in all the ups and downs of our life together? Or might this not continue? That kind of fear that we could have, and anxiety about that relationship. And then the last question, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? And the answer, of course, again, should be I am, for the bride and groom to be. And so this idea that for us to say that we are wedding ourselves to each other, that this is a complete gift in the sense of our fertility as well, and that God made marriage and sex for the good of children, for the both good of having children for the couple, but also the good that are children, to the world. The gift, this awesome gift that the world gets to receive, the church gets to receive these new children from God through the marital act. And so I think these questions of consent really help us to understand what is meant in the wedding vows themselves. And I'll just stop there so I don't dominate the conversation as a professor.
No, that's great. Any thoughts, Jean-Luc, on that, and how these vows are not just arbitrarily imposed, but actually correspond to the deepest yearnings of our heart?
Yeah, I think I'd probably emphasize also when it comes to the good of the spouses, the reality that like God has also given us marriage to grow as saints and to take on the world as faithful followers of Christ, right? And so I'm not going to speak too much to the theological side because that's not my area of expertise, but even on the very, I guess, human side or the purely human side, like there's this element of in bonding with someone else, you also gain all these resources, right, to actually take on the world and to do the work that Christ has given us to do, right? Like our spouse is a secondary means by which God bolsters us against the struggles that we're going to face, right? And we know that, like, that's how it's been for thousands of years now, that like we bond to someone and they give us the comfort and the help and the security that we need to do things that we couldn't otherwise do. And as the breakdown of marriage, now we're seeing lots of people break down in all parts of their life because they just don't have the accessibility of another person. But God's made us, he's made us for relationships with others. And so when we lose those relationships, we lose actually a lot of our own strength and our ability to deal with the world. So I think that's another element too when it comes even to marriage, that like God's giving you someone to help you take on the world, and that's one way that He's blessing you.
Right. Yeah, and I think too, I mean, as I prepare for marriage, there's certainly that sense of, this is God's support, right? And Scripture refers to the first couple and says that the woman is the man's helper, which doesn't mean his maid or his dishwasher. It means the word helper is most frequently used in the Old Testament to describe God's own relationship to man, right? Battle partner, right? The one who stands at one's side. So, and I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all yearn for that, right? Like no one wants to say, well, I'd like to grow old and alone and maybe have a couple one night stands and then pass out of existence, right? Like I think most of us recognize on a deeper level, if we're honest with ourselves, that what we do desire is faithful, lifelong commitment with the right person, and one day to be blessed by children and maybe grandchildren. And maybe that's not our first thought right now, but I do think it's something that, if we're honest with ourselves, is rooted very deeply within our hearts. So with all of this being said, and I just want to say hello again to people watching on Facebook or YouTube. You can always leave a comment in the comment section and we can answer any questions you might have. So with all this being said, I think we should maybe address very briefly some of the nitty-gritty issues, just because people are probably going to be wondering about them. I do just want to preface all of this by saying that this is by no means an exhaustive discussion of all these various issues. Any of these issues we mentioned are, you could spend hours and hours, talking about them, and there's books written on them. I'd refer you especially to the website Catholic.com, Catholic Answers. They have some great resources for that kind of thing, as well as the Ruth Institute has some excellent stuff, especially in marriage and family. So with all that being said, we presented kind of this vision of what God has for us in marriage, right? Our very bodies are meant to express the self-gift, this gift of love, right? Which is reflective of God's very love for us. And so this bar is set pretty high, right? We're called to love as God has loved us. And to do that, faithfully, fruitfully, fully, I'm missing one. Faithfully, fruitfully, fully. My mind is blanking now.
He's looking for us to help.
Yeah, I'm missing the fourth one.
Free. Did you say free?
Freely.
Free, faithful, full, and fruitful.
There you go. I'm human too. Okay. So the bar is set pretty high with these different criteria. So I just want to discuss briefly some of the common behaviors that our culture has come to accept as normal that fall short of this, and why the church teaches so strongly against it. Again, not as some arbitrary imposition, but as something that can undermine not just our own happiness, but even human dignity, and leads us away from the fullness that God has. So I think just the ones that we might want to focus on, just because I'd say they're the biggest ones, and by no means is this exhaustive, but certainly the first one I'd like to talk about that I think many people are in a position of is cohabitation. So for either of you, why do you think, cohabiting as a couple and engaging in premarital sex, even in a relationship that is, in theory committed, why does that still fall short of what God calls us to?
I'm waiting for Jean-luc to
chime
in first.
Want to go first? Okay. I mean, scientifically speaking, like when you think about the human body, especially for women, having sex is a huge commitment, potential commitment, right? Because you could get pregnant, and then that's going to be a 9-month-long process, and they're going to have a kid to take care of, potentially for the rest of your life, and they're going to outlive you. And so when it comes to just like in a very practical way, very practical spirituality, like you don't want to cohabit or have sex before marriage because you don't have the context, the proper context. Even if intent you do, in reality you haven't made like that firm, clear commitment to someone, right? In the sense that like they could still leave you, right? And it does happen, and that means that there's some instability there. And that instability, I think, on some level psychologically always affects people, right? Because you haven't sealed the deal and become married, and now you have someone that's for sure going to be there for you as far as you know. There's always that small sneaking little doubt in the background. It's like, but they could still leave you. Mm-hmm. They haven't made that full commitment to me. And that will naturally pick away at the relationship. Even if they intend to get married, like there's still the possibility it won't, and that leads to a degradation of the relationship, and of any sexual interactions they have, because that security is just not there. It's not full, and that's huge for us as human beings.
Yeah, just want to say hello to my good friend Oberon, who's just commenting and just letting us know that he's tuning in. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I think too, statistically speaking, from what I understand, couples that cohabitate before marriage typically and end up getting married typically have much higher divorce rates than couples that don't. So
yes. And there's good reason for that. And that's because they jumped the gun and they didn't make the proper commitment before they started doing the things that require that commitment, and that hurts the relationship. They're creating points of woundedness in the relationship that are going to just fester. So even when you're in married life, like that stuff's still going to be there, and if you don't resolve them, then your marriage is going to fail too.
Sure. Any thoughts, Dr. Gerlach?
Well, I just say that there's a lot of things we could talk about here, but I think we tend to over sexualize the relationship in our culture right away. So it's not just the hookup culture, but it's also the one night stands that turn into not one night stands, but people get together and decide, hey, you look like a good prospect or whatever. But what's problematic about that, from I think for a number of different standpoints, is that I think sexuality presupposes a certain level of spiritual friendship. In other words, you got to go deep before you can go too far. And I think of this, I always think of the analogy as the tree, right? The farther out the branches are, or the more weight it bears, the deeper the roots have to go, and this get the further extended. So it's also a mirror image, on the top and the bottom. So I think in sexuality as it's intended, if you're going to be out there with it, and you're going to be going far with it, there has to be a depth. This is just the way that we're both body and spirit as persons, as beings. So if we treat ourselves too superficially just as bodies, and the relationship was lived on that level, and we don't have the spiritual communion and friendship as the basis for that, we haven't developed that, we haven't taken the time it takes to build that kind of communion and friendship and tested that in different ways. We talk about 4 seasons. My wife got some good advice actually from a professor of marriage and family psychology, about going through 4 seasons together, before you get married, at least, right? So I think the same goes for before you ever have sex, because it's presupposed that, at least for a Catholic, you're waiting until marriage, though that doesn't necessarily happen. So I think that, again, that depth needs to be there, because the relationship has to be tested, go through the 4 seasons of a life, whether it's literal 4 seasons, if you have 4 seasons where you live, or if it's just metaphorically the ups and downs of a relationship. Like, you don't know who this person is fully till you've done that at some level. And if you can grow through each of those stages, you're setting a good foundation for the gift of self that's to be embodied in the sexual act. And if you don't do that, you're setting yourself up for a very shallow, root system, so it's just going to tip. It's going to cave at some point.
Yes, I want to add one more part to this because it came up while you were talking. Is that the other thing about having sex before marriage is that it also, because sex makes you feel good and it washes away lots of your anxieties and even depression, things that cause depression and sadness, it masks the problems you're going to see in the other person that would otherwise be a deal breaker, right? It's premature bonding, right? And and the point of that bonding is to help you overlook someone else's faults and feel closer to them. But that needs to happen after you're completely aware of their faults and have experienced them, not before, because otherwise it's going to mask the reality.
I think that's a great point. And if I could just continue with this, because this is really fascinating to me. There is such with how sexuality is treated in the culture right now, there's such a high level of sexual addiction, at least to pornography. But the easier cheap sex is made through hookup apps and things like that, the more at least the women should be fearing that the guys are coming in with a certain amount of baggage, and they're not coming in because they want an intimate, experience with you as a person. They're coming because they have a need that's even a compulsive one, perhaps, that they're entering a relationship with, and then there's behaviors that go along with addiction as an actual disease, as Jean-luc could better speak about than I can. And I think that should cause a person to pause, and say, look, let's make sure we're truly free in giving ourselves to one another in this act. And if it's driven by compulsion and addiction, it's not a fully human act in the way that God intends it to be for the people involved.
Yes, which is unfortunate because oftentimes most of the time the root of addiction is emotional in nature. And so actually by jumping the gun and going straight into sex, you're actually ignoring the element of a relationship that could be the healing part for you, right? So they're seeking sex because they know it works. We know it works amazingly for emotional pain. But the actual cure to that emotional pain is a deep relationship with another person a lot of the times. Because people have to use sex and drugs to cover over and to cope with emotional pain, but what they actually need is a healthy relationship. So
and then
all they know is a quick fix.
The things that come afterward, the shame or the feeling like I've been taken advantage of, or I've given myself in this way and I feel like there's something missing here, that can actually deepen the wounds too. So it masks them momentarily, and then there's deeper wounds, and the wounds are getting worse because the emotional moodedness is just getting, it's just kind of,
right.
Yeah, it just cycles. They need more and more intense things to fit the deeper wound, and so
right. Yeah, no, great. It was great watching you guys kind of go back and forth there. That's great. And I would just maybe add to that too. So obviously this falls in this kind of the four criteria that we've set forth. This really falls short of that faithfulness, that fidelity, right? I would also add just very briefly too that there is something very public about the nature of marriage, right? It's recognized by the state, it's recognized by the community. Oh, so and so are married, right? And so there's something about that too, where even if a couple has said, oh well, we're together, but we're just putting off marriage because I haven't messed with the ceremony and ritual. There is something that is intrinsic to pretty much every culture in human history has had an institution of marriage, right? So there is something about that. But just being mindful of our time, I do want to transition to one more topic, and then maybe have Dr. Gerlach share about his own experience about the joys of married life under the headship of Christ. So before we get to that, I'm going to kind of lump two areas in together that, again, we could spend hours talking about and maybe try to make it 5 minutes. but because they both, in a certain way but different, they both frustrate the fruitfulness that marriage intends. So the two areas that I'm thinking of that have become very much accepted widely by our culture, and it's very, very much taboo to speak against. But the areas that I'm referring to are contraception within heterosexual relationships, and then any kind of homosexual sexual activity. And so obviously our culture has accepted, certainly the latter as very normal. Certainly, Canada and the U.S., I believe it's now legal marriages for two people of the same sex. But of course, the church has still held to her teaching that no, this falls short of God's plan and design. And certainly fruitfulness is one of the main reasons for that. So I wonder if you guys could speak to those two things. If you want to just share some thoughts briefly on on why these two things, frustrate that fruitfulness and ultimately therefore work against our own happiness in the way that God's made us. So whoever wants to take a stab at it first.
I went first last time.
Okay, so I guess on contraception, beyond what I've said before, in our time together, I would probably just point to the fact that, again, for the meaningfulness of the act, there is a certain gravitas, a certain seriousness that comes when there is a risk, so to speak, of getting pregnant. Possibility of becoming, having of the woman getting pregnant and having a child to care for. Like that ups the ante quite a bit. And so you care, if that is an intrinsic part of the act, then you care a lot more about the act itself as a whole, and not just the pleasure you can get out of it. Because then you're thinking also of the overall context of your relationship and your life together. What is this going to mean for us, possibly? And then thinking about, wow, we have another child that we're going to be caring for together, and so on. So really, again, it's an act that's symbolic of fruitfulness, of procreation, even if it doesn't end up, in a conception. That the possibility, that potential, means that it has that meaning still in it. If you strip it away, if you take away fruitfulness and the possibility of procreation, then you've just reduced the meaning of the act and trivialized it in a certain way, that it's not meant to mean that. And of course, you could talk about natural family planning and the kind of discipline it takes to be able to have the relationship and have it a positive, growth relationship, even without contraceptives. Those would be like my brief comments on that.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in regards to contraception, I think what really sticks out to me is just kind of like with cohabitation, right? There's this implicit idea that there's still something a little bit wrong about what's going on, right? So just like with cohabitation, there's always the chance that things could go awry, that you're not actually together, you haven't made that full commitment. With contraception, there's always like this little voice that like you're not really loved for all that you are, right? There's still a rejection of a part of who you are, and that's your ability to bring life into the world. And that right there means that it's not, even if you really love them a whole lot, even if you really love the girl you're with, like you're still not fully in love with her. You haven't accepted her for all that she is. And that's, again, it's just like it's a chink in the armor that can let in a whole lot of pain later on in a relationship, and in ways that you're probably not going to realize, because it is like at this point it's so subtle in our culture. So
yeah. Absolutely. And just to clarify, in case people are unfamiliar, natural family planning is a method, and I won't say of birth control, but it's a method of regulating births within the context of marriage that involves periodic abstinence between the married partners. And it's proven highly effective. But as Dr. Gerlach says, also takes a lot of discipline, right? And so the words, the phrase I've heard it is, when you contracept, you're basically saying there's something wrong with your partner's body and you need to intervene to fix it. And their body needs to change, because that's the issue. When you practice NFP, your heart needs to change to respect the rhythms of your partner's body. So that's the difference there. So all that being said, comments on perhaps, same-sex attraction, homosexual behavior, those sorts of things.
Well, I would just say that I'm intrigued by some recent speakers who've been emphasizing, the treasury that the church has for spiritual friendship, for the deep kind of spiritual friendship that transcends physical attraction, whether it's male, female, same sex, or heterosexual. I'm intrigued by this move because I think what it does, it points again to that idea that we all have the nuptial meaning of our bodies is there, whether it's for the same sex or the opposite sex that is involved in the actual attraction. We're called somehow to give ourselves to others. And so, generally the church's teaching on this is that if we're experiencing that type of same-sex attraction, we're how do we put it? That the call to marriage in the male-female marriage is not probably the path for us, but there is a path to true spiritual friendship at a deep level with other people. And the thing that ties into the procreative side, which I wanted to make sure I talked about here and in relation to the contraception question, is that we're all called to spiritual paternity and maternity, or maternity. So we're all called to be spiritual parents. And I think that's, again, you have to go deeper for that. It's not just a physiological thing. It's not just a biological thing, but that also means for those who are sexually attracted to the same sex, that there can be true but spiritual parenthood that's involved of others. Like, we're all called to be parents to each other, and to have other figures in our life who exercise spiritual maternity and paternity over us. That we're looking to these guides. My one father is a great father, but he can't be father to me in all the ways I need a father. And the Heavenly Father, of course, is the supreme ideal of fatherhood. But same thing with motherhood. Like, I need maternal figures, right? And so I think that those who experience the same-sex attraction sometimes think, when they hear the church's teaching about this, that they're being robbed not just of the ability to give themselves sexually to each other, but the possibility of having some type of parenthood. But that's not the case. In fact, it actually points to the deeper reality of what the church sees in motherhood and fatherhood, which is fundamentally a spiritual thing. The most important thing I do as a father, a biological father, is my spiritual fatherhood of my own biological children. And I think, and there are ways that we can exercise those things. I know it's not the same, but there are true ways that are kind of denied if we, again, jump the gun, or we look too much to the physiological and the biological, and even the emotional, attraction that's there, to look deeper into, like, what is it that I'm called to as a person?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Jean-Luc, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think I just want to add on, like, that's an important conversation to have, because otherwise we're going to leave these people in a place where there's just no way out, right? And like, evidently, emotional pain's enough to drive us to do incredibly dangerous and stupid things, like drugs or other reckless behavior. And so it's necessary, not even just as a spiritual reality, but just as a physical necessity, that they have this experience of spiritual friendship and spiritual fatherhood or motherhood. Those two things are intrinsically linked, and it's necessary for them. And now we're being forced to deal with this reality, because it's back in our face again, right? Hasn't been since Roman times, and we didn't really deal with it then, for various reasons. But now we have to figure out, like, well, what's their place? What does it look like for them to be spiritual fathers and mothers? Especially with some of the stigma that naturally comes from, like, the sex crisis, and priests preying on people of the same sex but are younger, right? That's created a lot of a stigma there too, that we're also going to deal with in this conversation. So it's difficult, but we need to start doing it.
Yeah. And so, with all that being said, I do just want to, for people that are not familiar with the church's teaching in this area more specifically, I do just want to say, it says right in the Catechism that people with same-sex attraction are to be treated with the utmost dignity and respect, just like any other person, right? So it doesn't mean that God hates you. It doesn't mean that the church condemns you. What it does mean is that the way that you're called to live out your sexuality is going to look a little bit different. And so, and with that being said, I have heard stories of people who have experienced this same-sex attraction, but because the deeper reality of their body is that they're actually oriented to the opposite sex, through the grace of God, they have found the means to actually begin very healthy heterosexual relationships and become biological parents. So we won't get into that right now, but all to say, I think our culture likes to make your sexuality your identity, but the church would say that no, your identity is being rooted in the love of the Father through Jesus Christ. That's the fullness of what it means to be human. So with that being said, I just want to transition now. I'm looking at the time. I know, Dr. Gerlach, you probably have to get going soon. But I'm wondering, wondering if you could share a little bit about your own experience of marriage and family and that journey when it's been for you. And in a very specific way, how Jesus Christ brings the fullness of that he calls all of us to, the fullness of life and happiness.
Great question. My version is going to be quite different than my wife and my kids' version of my role and my.
Sure.
Yeah, I think for me, well, a couple highlights from the story, I guess, from my personal story. I went to the seminary and discerned priesthood for 3.5 years, and I discerned out partly because I fell in love with a girl that was a friend of mine from college who was part of our friend group. And we were friends at a very deep level because we studied theology, talked spiritual things. And as I discerned out, we pretty much immediately knew we were going to get married. But it wasn't primarily because we were physically attracted at first or whatever, but that we knew that we had something so deep in common that it could be the bedrock for a relationship of marriage. And we knew we wanted the same things from marriage. And we even tried to make our marriages, we were getting prepared for marriage, annulment proof. Basically like looking at, okay, what does the church say about that whole can of worms that we could talk about for another hour? I'll have my wife on since she's done work in that area as a defender of the bond. But so that was, there are all kinds of things there that were beautiful about the story and that remain true today. And we can keep going back to those things, in the ups and downs of married life and family life together, that we're on the same page fundamentally. And I think that's been an important part of that. And in regards to sexuality too, we used to talk about what we called then, I don't know if I call it that, but Christian sex. Sex done the way Christians should are called to do it. And because we saw this nobility of the vision that the church has, and I think, Christ did work in both of our hearts and continues to do work in our hearts. We're not perfect. We both have different kinds of wounds and things that go back even before we were married. And so we bring those things to the Lord each day and in different ways, and they come up in different times. But we know that it's a process, and it's a battle, but that also means that there's hope. There's hope of victory, a real hope, because we know that Jesus Christ has conquered all these things and gives us, the grace of healing, for this area. So in fact, marriage is meant to be not just like a state of happiness, but really a road, a path to mutual happiness together. But it doesn't come all at once. It comes by hard work and effort, and dying to yourself, like dying to the sinful parts, the selfishness, the wanting to take, not receive, but take from the other, and finding ways of being able to give and to receive the other, and who the other is. And again, the greatest gift that we have in our marriages are our children. We have 4 children, 20, 19, 16, and 12. And my second oldest, Katerina, is 19 today. She's at John Paul Catholic out in San Diego. And they've been a huge blessing. And just to see we see some of our faults, in them. So they remind us of but also the beautiful ways in which some of our strengths are magnified. Like they've taken certain things that we have that are good things, and then we see them magnified in them. And so it's a beautiful gift to us. And growing. I know some people who missed having children because they didn't want kids. They didn't think that they should bring a child into the world, or they didn't think they'd be good parents. That sort of thing, even close people in my life. And they now they're like, wow, I may grow old alone and not have anyone to care for me. And what I've experienced is this beautiful adult level relationship that I'm having with my adult kids now. And not to say that I'm looking for them taking care of me, although I do admit that I have a little more security. I feel a little bit more secure about that. But just these are lifelong friends too. and we've had a lot that we've gone through together and struggled through together. But we have these friendships now that are becoming more equal, as they become adults. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's just a taste, I guess, of my own background, my own story.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's a great kind of note to end on. Jean-Luc, I'm wondering if you have any kind of closing comments or things you'd like to say with regards to everything we've talked about today.
Closing comments? I think I just want to really emphasize and on the note that marriage is an integrated experience, right, of the whole person, two people together, right, and then also with God, right? It has a whole lot of meaning, and marriage is even a reflection of God Himself, in a sense. If you want to take the concept of the image of God even further, right, it's not just each individual, but it's even people in relationship with each other, just as God is in relationship with Himself between three persons. And that has a lot of depth to it that I think all of us should take time to reflect on. What reality we're really living out day to day, and what that means.
Excellent. Yeah. And Dr. Gerlach, any closing remarks as well?
I would just say that, I'm constantly, and I invite people to reflect on the church's teaching on sexuality and marriage. It's a humbling teaching in a couple different ways. It's humbling because it feels like a standard and ideal that is not achievable. It's also humbling because we're privileged to be invited into it, to be invited to strive for it. And it's a beautiful gift. And, it would be overwhelming and just a matter of despair for me personally, and I'm sure for others, if we didn't know that, Jesus Christ has the grace for us to live this out. Like, it's not like He says, you must do these things and you're on your own. It's like,
good luck. Yeah.
This is what the church, this is my vision for you and for your life. And guess what? I'm going to give you a spirit of love, the Holy Spirit, right inside of you to empower you like an engine of love, for this, for all the tasks, all the things that go into a loving relationship, and as well as figuring out, what does Christian sex actually mean? What is that? What is the nobility of that call to use the gift of sexuality as it's meant to be used within the relationship? So
yes, amen to that. Well, thank you for those comments. I think I would just end by just saying, everything we said is excellent. I would recommend The Good News About Sex and Marriage by Christopher West as a great resource for anyone who's wanting to learn more. As well, there's a short book written by one of Dr. Healy, actually, who I had on last week, another one of the professors at Sacred Heart. It's called Men and Women Are From Eden. EDEN. Men and Women Are From Eden. You can find those both probably online. But short reads and some really good practical insights as well. And I just like to say to anybody who's watching who maybe is feeling perhaps ashamed or looking at their lives and just saying, everything you've talked about, maybe there's some areas I'm falling short, whether that's cohabitation, pornography, same-sex relationships, whatever it may be. Just to reaffirm that, all of us have things we struggle with, but God is always calling us into deeper and deeper love. And so, Jesus Christ does offer us that freedom. He can take away sin, and He can lead us into eternal life, right? Because ultimately, if we choose to reject God in this life, we're choosing to reject Him forever. And if we choose to live our lives outside of the way He wants us to live, there are consequences to that. But the Lord is always good and merciful, and He has the fullness of life for us. So I think with all that being said, I want to say thank you to Dr. Gerlach and to Jean-Luc for joining. If you want to,
pleasure.
Yes, thank you. If you want to get in touch with them, you can always send an email to uprojectoutreach@gmail.com. It's the letter U, projectoutreach@gmail.com. Or you can comment on the videos, and I'll make sure to pass on your remarks, questions, comments to them, and they can answer stuff. So, and Natalia says, amen. Thanks for this great stuff. Thanks, Natalia. Okay, with that being said, we are going to end the broadcast. God bless everyone. We'll see you next week.
Here. Thanks, Avery.